Halt! I skidded to a halt on the gravel, miniature clouds of dust billowing up around my sneakers. Tugging out my earbuds, I looked around for anyone else, but all around me were hundreds of acres of green. My legs ached to resume my interrupted morning run, but I just couldn't shrug off what I thought I'd heard. Help! Somebody help me! There it was again, just a few feet away from me. So loud that it rang in my ears, but now, thoroughly convinced that it wasn't my imagination, I ran to the source of the sound. I pushed past the labyrinth of trees that crowded my path until I found myself in a forest clearing. There was no person, only an old well so overgrown by ivy it was almost invisible next to the trees. The faded gray stone glimpsed through it. There was a bucket attached to a rotting rope still dangling from the rafters of the half-caved-in roof. The thought arose in my mind, so unbelievable that it was almost laughable. Surely, the sound hadn't come from... I peered over the crumbling stone edge. Below me, the ring concrete gave way to an endless darkness so dizzyingly deep that I felt twinges of vertigo. It had to be a 50-foot drop. Hello? I called down, my voice rebounding off the circling walls. A few seconds of silence that followed were enough to make me leave, and then something happened that had me stop in my tracks. Don't go, please! Please don't go! I'm down here! The very voice I just assumed to be a figment of my heatstroke-ridden mind ricocheted up from the depths of the ancient structure. It was high-pitched, almost childlike. I'd seen it in cartoons as a kid and laughed along with all the old Timmy and the Well jokes, but never thought that I'd be confronted with such a situation in real life. I leaned farther over until I almost tumbled in myself. Are you alright? I bellowed down. I fell down here. I can't move. Please go get help. Despite the surrealness of it all, I faced the situation with rationality. Someone's life had been thrust into my hands, and what I did in the next few minutes decided whether they would live or die. I found myself determined to make the right choice. As I unzipped my jacket pocket and thumbed 911 into the number pad, I found myself more grateful for my fastidiousness than I had ever been. I'd always brought it along with me on the hunch of an emergency, despite living in a relatively peaceful area. I mean, you never know what could happen in country roads, after all. Hello, 911, what's your emergency? A female voice crackled through the line. I sucked in a breath while trying to think of a way to summarize my situation and quell my own growing panic. I think that somebody's trapped down a well. This was followed by a few seconds of disbelieving, static-laced silence, probably thinking that it was a prank. My chest tightened. A well, sir? Yes, I burst out, with more force than I had intended. I think whoever's down there is hurt. You gotta send someone, right away. Her tone remained skeptical, but the cries restarted behind me, which soon reached an ear-splitting crescendo, and were enough to convince her otherwise. All right, sir, can you give me your location? I proceeded to give her all the necessary information with one hand clasped to my ear, while the phone was pressed up to the other, trying to drown out the noises. Units have been dispatched to your location. Just stay on the line with me, she continued. Keep talking to them. Try to make sure that they're still conscious. Her cool voice stood like a shining lighthouse in the ocean of panic that roared up in my mind. I pulled the phone away from my ear and leaned back down into the vertiginous blackness. Hey, I called down. Help is coming. Stay with me, okay? The only sound I received was the echo of my own voice. Icy fear prickled down my spine. Hello? I swallowed. No answer. The cries for help had been replaced by a terrifying quiet. A compilation of horrible scenarios played without pause through my mind. They'd sustained a head wound, and the resulting blood loss had rendered them unconscious. They were too weak to cry out anymore, or even worse. They'd finally succumbed to their conditions. Whatever the answer, there was nothing good about that hush. I knew that I couldn't stand by and wait around any longer, not when there was someone else's life at risk. The withering groan of the long-rusted bucket as the playful zephyrs danced around it, as it dangled from the rafters above the dizzying drop, provided my anxious mind with the solution it craved. I started on untangling the weather-beaten rope that suspended it in place. By some miracle, I managed to undo the thick knot, tossing the bucket onto the ground where it rolled to a stop just a few feet away. Someone must have been smiling down on me that day, I thought. How wrong I was. I cranked the ancient lever, that dilapidated gears of the pulley creaking into life as the freed rope trailed down into the darkness. "I've got a rope!" I cried down. "Climb up!" I prayed to whatever god was out there that it would still be strong enough to hold them. I wrapped my own hands around it, digging my feet into the ground. The limp rope snapped into a rigid string, vibrating with movement as a weight began to rise it. The blood vessels in my body swelled to near bursting points. My muscles tensed up as a fresh sheen of sweat formed on my already soaked brow. It felt like I was trying to dredge the wreck of the Titanic up from the cold, briny depths of the North Atlantic. I couldn't understand how one person could be so heavy. Despite the searing burns the friction of the material left on the palms of my hands, I refused to let go. I was determined to bring the poor soul trapped down there back into the light. As the weight increased, I found myself pulling inch by inch to the well, my heels leaving curved, muddy trails in the once undisturbed, verdant wild grasses until I was mere inches from joining them in the darkness. As I squinted in, I could make out the faint outline of something coming up. "You're almost there! I got you!" Just as I was preparing one final heave, something cold and wet slapped against my forearm, and the shock of the sudden contact was enough to almost make me let go. Looking down, I saw a pale human hand clamped around my wrist, blackened, grimy fingernails digging deep enough into my flesh to leave tiny white indentations. Slick green mildew ringed around its bony wrist like a macabre bracelet. "Thank you so much." The voice had changed, becoming older and raspier. It was the voice of a veteran smoker, the kind whose lungs were punctured with Swiss cheese holes from their 2-pack-a-day habit. Gone was the hyperventilating panic, replaced by a hungry gloating, the kind that I would imagine spiders to experience whenever a foolhardy fly had become entangled in their web. The more I tried to shake it off, the tighter the hold became, until I could feel my wrist bones popping. "Come down," the horrible, high-pitched voice continued. "Come down into the dark with me. Please, I need you." I tugged with enough force to send the lower half of my body slamming into the stony edge of the well. The scream that was building up in my throat exited instead as a strangled gasp. Even if I could have, there would have been no one around for miles to hear me. The only other sound I could hear aside from the blaring throb of my own panicked heart in my head was the voice of whatever was down there. The guttural syllables of its grating pleas seemed to scratch the insides of my ears. It wasn't just a fight for my very life, but just to breathe. Despite the emaciated state of the limb, it possessed an incredible strength, almost enough to pull me off my feet. The only thing keeping me from plunging down was the rotting wooden beam of the arching roof, the soaked, mildew-covered wood splintering my fingertips. All I could see was darkness, the subterranean coldness wafting up against my face as if someone or something was breathing against it. It wasn't speaking anymore, just letting off hoggish squeals and snuffling grunts as its grip got stronger. Channeling every ounce of strength that was left in my body, I wrenched my arm up, but it refused to let go. Its pallid arm stretched up with mine, almost serpentine. The limb seemed to have no bones, stretching down endlessly into the ground, longer than any human arm should have been. I wasn't about to see what kind of creature it was attached to. A sudden burst of endorphins through my struggling body provided me with enough strength that I needed. With one final heart-clenching pull, I felt the crushing pressure on my arm release. I tumbled backwards, my head bouncing off the soil, the tiny red rivulets dripping from the deep, trailing scratches left on my skin, soaked into the dewy grass. The air shook with a rage-fueled feral shriek, loud enough to shake loose a few pebbles. The sparking scrape of heavy claws rang out from down below. Too exhausted and euphoric to be afraid, my eyes lulled back towards the calm blue expanse of the sky. The soft white clouds cushioned against it, growing to consume my vision as if I had been submerged in milk. The last thing I remember before falling into unconsciousness was the acrid taste of my own blood in my own mouth, seeping down from the burst capillaries inside my nose. When the ambulance arrived, they only found me lying unconscious with my phone still clutched in my hand, bleeding heavily from unexplained wounds that trailed up from my wrist to about my mid-elbow. There was no well, only a smoldering circle of blackened, sulfur-scented grass, 4 feet in diameter, where the well once stood. I live in one of the former Soviet republics, and I run a small urban exploration YouTube channel. I post videos of my explorations of creepy abandoned places, of which there is no shortage of. For the most part, the only thing creepy about these places is that they've been abandoned and are disconnected from the rest of society. I often have to edit my videos quite a bit, adding wicked screams and sinister silhouettes to make them even remotely interesting. Last week was different. So I went to visit an allegedly abandoned military experimentation site from the Soviet era. I had to explore it. The thought of it was euphoric. I'd get more views and shares than I ever had before. I was considering bringing my friend along since the site was considerably more remote than the rest. I abandoned the thought, not wanting to waste any more time in finding and preparing an accomplice. I embarked on my solo mission, as I had done many times over in the past year. The desolate facility was remarkably difficult to locate, and the day had already drawn into afternoon by the time I had managed to find it. The building was nothing spectacular to look at. If I was to describe it simply, I'd say that it was a giant rectangular concrete slab with doors and windows placed in a mundane pattern. I didn't begin recording until I had entered the dull gray structure. I feared that many would abandon my video right after seeing the extremely boring architecture of the building's exterior. As soon as I had entered the building, I felt an uncanny feeling of dread course through my body. Chills ran through my spine and my hair stood up straight. I ignored this feeling, ever motivated by my passion for my YouTube channel. I chalked up the uneasiness to a bad case of nerves and persisted on. A certain coldness emanated from each room and seemed to dissipate as I climbed into the higher floors of the building. The next 2 hours were uneventful, to say the least. I explored the entirety of the building, ignoring the sense of unease that left the hairs on my back stand up. The building had some peculiar artifacts such as isolation cells and weird testing chamber contraptions, but nothing struck me as inherently sinister about it. I was too busy faking reactions to them and thinking of the views that I would get, oblivious towards the implications of these uncanny apparatus. I was on my way out, happy to have recorded so much when I saw the padlocked door to the staircase that led downward. The sun had gone dipping below the horizon, and the sense of eeriness had only been amplified. The fear I had was overpowered by the thoughts of making another video dedicated to the basement of this abandoned site. 2 videos for the effort of 1, I thought. Taking no more time to think further, I excitedly strolled towards the metal doors that nature had certainly tarnished over the years. The padlock was similarly rusted and weak. The 2 wrenches trick seemed to do the trick. It snapped off with a cleanliness I hadn't expected. I felt like a mayor cutting the ribbon to a new building in the city. The elation that ran through my veins had blocked out the looming sense of dread momentarily. As the door opened, I was met with a putrid stench. I felt the atmosphere grow warm and humid. I should have turned back right there, but my curiosity and ambition propelled me forward. The basement was quiet. Too quiet. The corridors were narrow, and the doorways led into large rooms. I'd never been more thankful for my massive 100-watt LED flashlight, the one that lit up every crevice of the uncanny hallways. As I walked into one of the rooms, I was surprised by its peculiar 2-segment design. While one part of the room was an observation post, the other was a massive enclosure being overlooked by the aforementioned observation post. These observation posts were most abnormal in their structure, a small room with a few seats, metal desks separated from the larger concrete enclosure by 5-inch thick glass. What was even more surprising was that the larger segment of the room had no doors or windows. No way to access them except by breaking the 5-inch thick glass. The entire basement was just a repetition of these identical rooms. They had been abandoned in a hurry. That much was clear from the notebooks and mugs still on the desks of the rooms. But what had they been observing? And what could these empty concrete hollows with no clear path of entry or exit have held? These questions were answered when I entered the last room on the most secluded corner of the basement. I knew something was inside from the muffled footsteps I heard. The footsteps were too discreet and coordinated to be animalistic in their origin. These footsteps did not resemble the sound of one or two people. It sounded like a crowd was walking inside the damn room. I should have turned back right there. There was a sliver of hope then. But now there isn't. As I walked into the room, my gaze was immediately transfixed on the scene before me. An army of what appeared to be people, all having halted their previous activity, staring at me with cold, transfixed glares. Though they appeared human, there was something morbidly wrong with them. Some inexplicable feeling told me that this silent lot of abominations had nothing human left in them, bar their physical resemblance. It was in their movement and their eyes, their aimless stares transcribed horrors in my mind that cannot be wholly comprehended or explained. The real horror began when they started to speak. They spoke in unison, their voices a macabre cacophony of sounds that should never have been heard, much less understood by the sane mind. They spoke in a morbid and infernal tongue, one from realms far outside this world, yet somehow inexplicably comprehensible. They told me things I never want to hear. They spoke of the universe, they spoke of their past. They spoke of things beyond the veil of sanity and reality. Their Tartarian language was one that no sane human had uttered before. It was a language each person was familiar with, yet so detached from at the same time. I have no words for the things they say, but each word served as a foul memory of things the mind does not want to comprehend. I didn't want to listen to them, yet I was transfixed. I wanted to know, regardless of how nightmarish the sound of each wretched syllable was. Their damned speech lasted a fraction of a second, and an eternity at the same time. Within that dreadfully long instant, they had made my mind witness a myriad of unearthly horrors that it should not and cannot comprehend. Somehow, within those horrors, they had told me of how they had become this way. How whatever that was human about them was replaced by this abominable monstrosity that resided in them all. Through harrowing riddles and stories, they told me of their origins. The scientists at this facility that had tampered with their minds and somehow created drugs that allowed these test subjects to reconnect with memories that the mind would rather keep hidden. I could never fully repeat the extent of the horrors each syllable transcribed in my mind. Most I could do was provide you with a summary of how they had become this way. When we were very young, and when we were unconscious, our minds were not fully capable of fending off against antagonistic forces that infiltrate and fester in our unconscious. When we're young, we haven't fully developed a defense to these forces. When we're asleep, our minds must rest so they can continue this hidden struggle amongst those damn forces the next day. Mother Nature protects us from these memories of terror and anguish. Mother Nature shields us from the repulsively macabre and abominable thoughts that lie in the infinitely dark recesses of the mind. She hides away these memories in inaccessible vaults, never to be opened by the developed or fully conscious human mind. What these researchers had done here was made these damn memories accessible to the conscious mind and had subsequently unleashed a darkness that no one can fully understand. I don't recall how, but I managed to leave that wretched place and return home in the midst of darkness and night. The unforgiving stars providing no consolation from the horrors that I had beheld. In the days that followed, my feelings of fear and dread had been replaced with one much worse: hopelessness. Not only had I been witness to horrors outside the veil of sanity, but I had been exposed myself to a repugnant and contagious illness of the inner mind. Let me explain. It's been a week since I visited the facility. I've deleted all the footage I captured as to deter others from ever wishing to explore these accursed halls. This feeling of hopelessness has birthed from an urge that I've been having as of late. I began thinking in the otherworldly tongue those abominations spoken. I mean, not deliberately, but out of an inexplicable urge deep down within me. An urge I can't explain. I fear it's not long before I start speaking in that infernal language too. Before I too become an abomination out of a man. I'm going to make sure I don't become one amongst these shells of human beings that now mindlessly roam within wretched halls, mumbling in a language that's becoming more and more familiar to me every day. Please don't go exploring places you shouldn't. You may just learn a new language. Like I did. It started from the first night I'd moved into my new apartment. After a difficult day of packing and unpacking, I finally collapsed in bed. I remember being relieved that I didn't start my new job working the till at a local bookstore till the day after tomorrow. As I drifted off without fear of an alarm, I smiled at the thought of sleeping till noon. "Excuse me?" A high-pitched, gentle voice called out. It stirred me a little, but I was still half asleep. I was able to drift off when I heard it again. "Excuse me?" This time the voice was accompanied by a few sniffles. I was confused and still dazed from a heavy sleep. Maybe it was a part of my dream, leaking into reality as I fought from drifting back to sleep. "Excuse me, please?" This time there was clear crying. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The voice seemed whispered, yet I felt it ringing clearly in my head. More awake now, I looked at my phone, seeing it was 3:20 in the morning, about 9 hours sooner than I'd hoped to be up. Strangely, I don't remember being afraid. Although I was hearing a voice despite being alone in my room, something about that voice seemed innocent, confused by what was going on. I said out loud, "Hello?" It was silent for a while. I was about to laugh it off and go back to sleep when I heard a response. "Hello? Can you help me, please?" The desperation in the voice made my heart sing. As I shot out of bed and turned my bedside lamp on, I looked around my room, trying to find the source of the voice, but all I saw were a few scattered possessions and some empty boxes. "Who are you? What's your name?" I asked aloud. "I'm Tyler. I don't know, it's dark." The cries were replaced by sniffles once more, but the fear in the poor child's voice was palpable. I didn't understand what was going on. Was I hearing some kind of ghost? What was I supposed to do if it was? All I felt was that I had to help Tyler. I heard a cry of agony, which hurt all the more in the child's voice. "Mommy died when I was born. Daddy put me in here." "In where?" "In the dark." Did ghosts talk about other dead people? Or was a kid really trapped somewhere close enough for me to hear? My new apartment was on the ground level. One of my walls was shared with an old lady, Miriam, who lived alone, and the apartment on the other side was empty. My landlord, Jeff, lived in the flat above me, but as far as I knew, he didn't have a kid around Tyler's age. I still struggled to place the direction the voice was coming from. It almost sounded like it was inside my head. I placed my ear up to the wall and I moved to each corner of the room to see if it was any louder anywhere. "Are you hurt?" "A little. There's a bruise on my arm from when Daddy threw me in here. I'm scared. Please help me. Please don't go away." "It's okay, Tyler. I'm here. I'm gonna help you. I'm not going anywhere." I heard Tyler fight back a sob. "Thank you." By now, I'd moved all around the room and still couldn't find anywhere where Tyler's voice was particularly louder or softer. I wanted to call the cops, but what if this was just a ghost? What if this was a kid? I couldn't risk it. "Okay, well, I'm gonna call the police now, Tyler. They'll come help." "Okay." I grabbed my phone and I called the cops. The dispatcher seemed confused when I said I could hear a little boy trapped, although I didn't know where the sound was coming from. I tried to explain, but it didn't seem to make sense to them. It barely made sense to me. When I explained that Tyler had mentioned a bruise from being thrown by his dad, however, the dispatcher told me to expect a response in about 20 minutes. I said aloud, still unsure which direction I should be facing, "They're coming, Tyler. They'll be here soon to help." "Thank you." "Now, can you feel anything around you? How big is the room you're in?" "There's nothing else in here. It's too small for me to stand up." "Are they really coming?" Yes, Tyler, they'll be here soon. I thought about whose kid Tyler could be. Maybe some other tenant who threw the poor kid in a space in the wall, somewhere in the building? Somewhere close enough that his voice would carry over to me? Given there was only one name I knew in the entire building, I decided to try it, even though he never mentioned having a kid. Hey, Tyler? Yeah? Is your daddy's name Jeff? Yeah. The part of me that was worried that I'd called the cops after hearing a ghost disappeared. That monster upstairs had thrown poor Tyler somewhere small and dark and trapped him in there. Thankfully, I could hear sirens by now, closing in quickly. Tyler, you with me? They're here. You might have to help them find you. I heard no response. My heart dropped. I couldn't take anything happening to the kid now, not when help was so close. I heard a car park outside and ran out to meet them. Upstairs, the kid is trapped somewhere in my landlord's room. I led the 2 police officers upstairs. They knocked loudly, yelling for Jeff to let them in. A few seconds later, Jeff opened the door and rubbed his eyes. What's going on? He inquired groggily. We had a report that a kid's been abused here. Please step aside so we can search your home. Still clearly in the process of waking up, Jeff stepped aside. As the cops moved in to search the room, I entered behind them and turned to Jeff. Where are you keeping him? Where's Tyler, you sick bastard? Tyler. I saw the cops in the bedroom opening up a wardrobe. I ran towards them, hoping they'd find the kid there, but there was just some old clothes. I moved to the walls and started yelling, Tyler, we're here to help. The cops have come. Please say anything. Where are you? Silence. The cops looked at each other, confused. The landlord looked strangely solemn, although I could tell that he was regarding me with pity. I turned to the cops and tried to explain. Please, you have to help me, okay? I heard the kid. He was crying. He wanted help. He said Jeff hurt him and trapped him in a small, dark room. The cops looked unconvinced. But they searched as thoroughly as they could. It was a small apartment, so it didn't take that long. There was no word from Tyler, and the cops couldn't find anything. And after a while, they apologized to me and to Jeff and suggested that I might look into getting some help at perhaps therapy. They apologized once more, and they left me, leaving me and Jeff alone. I stared at him angrily. I know you've got Tyler somewhere. I'm gonna find him. Tyler's dead. That took me aback. What? Yeah, my kid Tyler, he died a few years ago. You're not the first one to hear him, though. And that shocked me even more. No, I heard him. He was crying. He wanted help. Yeah, sometimes he cries. Sometimes he asks for help. The flat next to you gets it too. That's why the previous tenant left. The old lady on your other side can hear with a dam, so it doesn't bother her. I wasn't convinced. In a harsh tone, I asked, how did he die? In almost patronizing yet sad tone, Jeff replied, it's all history now. Don't make me revisit it again. It was hard enough going through it once. That little shit killed my Victoria too. I noticed him lose his composure as he spoke, fighting to stop himself from saying more. I was afraid about what he would do next, but he just took a deep breath, faced me again, calm. Like I said, it's history now. You killed him, I said in shock and rage. You abused him when he was alive, and then you killed him. His face twisted in anger, although he forced his voice to remain calm. Just go downstairs and leave it be. Invest in headphones. Or even better, leave. I'll tear up your tenant's agreement anytime you want. Fuming but unable to say anything more, I hung my head and I stumbled back downstairs. Back to my place. I wanted to call the cops again. I wanted to do something, but what? I couldn't do anything. I barely even knew what happened back then. I knew then that I needed to find somewhere else to live. I sat down on my bed, turned on my phone, noting that it was around 5 a.m. at that point. And I began browsing through the same apartment listing websites that I'd used to find this place. And that's when I heard it again. The same innocent, pained voice that started this. Excuse me? Please? Can you help me? I thought to myself, no. and wiped away the tears that were brimming in my eyes.
I knew better. My mother raised me better. Nice girls don't do things like that. I never should have gone to that bar on the edge of town. I knew not to take a stranger home, but I was drunk and he was cute, and it was the last cold snap of the spring, and the heater in my drafty old apartment was broken. I fell asleep with my back pressed against his solid warmth. But I woke up in the dark before sunrise, and I was cold again. He had slipped out sometime in the night. I felt deflated and a bit foolish. That's what you get, I told myself. I grabbed an extra blanket and closed the window. It was a couple of days later that the itching started. It was intense and originated somewhere deep inside me, somewhere that couldn't be scratched. It was manageable at first with a tube of cream from the drugstore, but the itch eventually burned through every temporary solution I applied. It radiated from the tender center of my body and drove me mad. Nothing helped. I tried not to scratch at the delicate flesh down there, but it got to the point that I couldn't help it. And then the smell began. I hid myself in embarrassment and started avoiding people. Even though nobody could see my condition, I worried that they can smell that cloying organic smell. It soaked through the layers of my clothes, a noxious blend of late summer flowers and rotting meat. It lingered on the back of my tongue. It clung to every chair I sat in, wafted from the crotch of every pair of pants I owned. Wearing a skirt was out of the question. I risked it one hot summer day when my air conditioner had frozen over. I nearly vomited from the fetid stench that unfurled beneath my dress and was held captive by the motionless air. It didn't matter how many times I showered or how thoroughly I scrubbed myself. The smell was inexorable, slowly leaching back out from the inside of me. I launched an internal investigation one day during a particularly heavy-handed bath. It felt strange in there, the usual softness interrupted by some sort of firm, gelatinous shape that provoked no sensation when prodded. It felt like touching my foot after it falls asleep. Touching it made me feel nauseous. Everything made me feel nauseous. I kept having nightmares about pale, distended grubs writhing beneath the surface of my skin, falling out of my mouth, falling out of other places. I knew something was wrong, but a trip to the doctor wasn't in the budget. The pieces clicked one day when I was writing a shopping list and thought about how long it had been since I'd bought tampons. I finally went to the clinic. I didn't have health insurance, so I was shuffled to the bottom of the list. I sat gingerly on one of the faded fabric chairs, shifting and sweating as my nether regions itched mercilessly beneath my clothes. The smell, oh God. The smell was permeating my jeans already. The waiting room was thick with it, syrupy and rancid. I had to pee so badly by the time they called me back that I made a mess trying to collect a sample in the little plastic cup. The test was positive. They pried me open with a cold metal instrument they called a speculum and peeped inside of me. This was followed by an uncomfortable invasion by a gloved hand. As the familiar stink bloomed in the small examination room, a heavy flush of shame settled over me. "Huh," said the doctor from behind her mask. "That's odd." I floated down the hallway to the ultrasound room in a daze. It only got more confusing. When the tech smeared the thick plastic wand with the clear jelly and slid it up inside me, there was nothing there. No heartbeat, no fetus, nothing. On the fuzzy gray screen, but a neatly folded womb that gave no sign of ever having been inhabited. The tech was baffled and consulted at length in the hallway with the doctor and the nurse. I waited, shivering in my thin hospital gown, until they returned. They told me there was nothing to be done. False pregnancy is like that, they said. You just have to wait it out. Eventually, your body will realize that it's decorating for a guest that will never arrive. What about the other stuff? I said. What about the... what about the smell? They were polite about it. Probably a minor bacterial infection, but they'd run an STD panel and let me know for sure by the end of the week. They offered me a cheap course of generic antibiotics and a topical cream that I couldn't afford. I thanked them and went home with the speculum I had stolen tucked into my purse. When I got home, I washed it thoroughly and then laid down a towel on the bed. I made sure a source of light and a hand mirror were nearby. It took me a few tries to get it inserted properly. Once I had it in place, I reached cautiously between my legs and felt around in the gap afforded by the instrument. Something was definitely wrong. It felt distressingly unfamiliar, crammed with alien folds that resisted my prodding. I pushed deeper blindly. Something was blocking the way. It felt fleshy, round, and it spasmed when my finger made contact. My stomach turned. I pulled away. I grabbed the hand mirror, trying to position it between my legs so that I can see between the stainless steel jaws that propped me open. The light was tricky. Everything had to be angled just right. Something metallic glinted from the depths of the shadowy opening, something lodged deeper than the speculum. I frowned and hunched closer, peering into the mirror. Something round and silver looked back. It blinked. The mirror fell to the floor in a tinkle of broken glass. I yanked the speculum out of me with a disgusting slurp. It clanked as it fell beside the remains of the mirror. No. I burrowed into the blankets, pulling them over my head. I kept my legs clamped shut and imagined I could feel something throbbing, wriggling, trying to squirm its way out. A hot, prickly wave of nausea washed over me. I fumbled with the window latch and sagged against the sill as the cool air flooded in. Pulling the covers back over my head, I fell into an uneasy sleep. I dreamed that I was floating above my body, watching a wet, pale, glistening thing unfold itself slowly from between my legs as I slept. It squirmed, contracting and expanding as it oozed out of my body. Thick, clear fluid gushed out of me with each rhythmic convulsion. It went on and on and on. It was almost as long as me, when it finally pulled free in one last vicious spurt. It left a slippery trail behind as it dragged itself inch by pulsating inch to the open windowsill. The next morning, the itching had finally stopped. I was so relieved that I cried. An inserted finger confirmed that my internal structure was once more soft and blessedly normal. No trace of the tightly coiled mass I had glimpsed the night before. I was finally free. The smell, though. The smell lingered. I washed my sheets 3 times, and still I could smell it. Whatever crawled out of me had left a wide gray stain that dried stiff and wouldn't come out no matter how many times I pre-treated it. I finally gave up and resigned myself to sleeping on a bare mattress. I flipped it over to escape the stain, but the smell still drifted up to haunt my nostrils from beneath. Still, I figured I would fall asleep as easily as breathing in the absence of that godforsaken itch. I quickly realized that I had celebrated too soon. My room was suffocatingly hot. My clothes twisted around me, strangling and uncomfortable until I stripped them off and found that my body had not yet run out of tricks. My breasts were swollen and throbbing, like they were full of liquid fire. They had doubled, nearly tripled in size. They looked absurdly like overripe fruits dangling from my chest, shiny and purple and about to split. Sharp bolts of pain stabbed through them every time I shifted in a fruitless attempt to find a position that didn't hurt. My teeth chattered as if I were cold, but I was so hot I was sweating. The air in my bedroom felt stuffy and close, and the smell was everywhere, coating my lungs. I opened the window a crack, sighing in relief as the cool night air kissed my inflamed skin. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep. I dreamed of dripping roots and fat pink earthworms reaching blindly through the dirt. My teeth rotting and crumbling and falling out of my mouth. Tiny bats sinking their fangs into the sleeping necks of cows. In every dream, a tide of dull pain flowed in and out of my chest, and the taste of old sugar and decay lingered in my mouth. In every dream, I was cold. It was the chill breeze blowing in from the open window that finally woke me. My breasts no longer hurt. They hung soft and small as I lay curled on my side. There was a $50 spot on the mattress beneath them where some kind of white fluid had pooled and dried in the night, leaving nothing but a pearlescent film that dissipated in the morning sun. The bed was rumpled beside me, streaked with mud and weeds. In the hollow of the other pillow was a single downy feather. The room smelled sweetly and faintly of rot. It didn't last. The milk returned with a vengeance, and by evening I was even worse than before. But I left the window open and it happened again, the next night and the next. For a time it was almost sustainable. I went to bed with my breasts full and aching, but woke up relieved. Sometimes the dirt in the bed was pale riverbank sand, or thick smears of red clay. Sometimes there were shreds of golden moss and tattered brown leaves, or little green worms. The feathers were always silver. But soon, inevitably, the milk was not enough. I was sleeping more soundly than I should have been. My dreams were tangled and confusing, full of rustling wings and scuttling shadows with too many legs. I woke up feeling drained. My breasts hung shriveled and empty in the mornings, which seemed to come later and later each day. The areolas bloomed with bruises, fleshy auroras of purple and blue, to match the shadows under my eyes. I slept for 12, 13, 14 hours at a time, but somehow I never felt rested. It wasn't until I awoke to thick crusts of dried blood on my nipples that I realized what I was going to have to do. It's not what nice girls do. I went back to that bar on the edge of town. It seemed like the only place to pick up another stranger. I caught myself looking for the first one, but to be honest, I couldn't even remember his face. Only his shoulders, and the smell of the alcohol in his breath, like late summer flowers and rotting meat. I thought to look for the smell, but it was already in my nose, so it was everywhere. In the end, any warm body would do. I just picked one that seemed willing. Everyone has nipples. I took him home and waited while he grunted and panted and finally collapsed on top of me, waiting for the part where he rolled over and fell into a contented sleep, waiting for the rustle of feathers at the open window. When it came, I turned away and pressed my back against his solid warmth, ignoring the jostling movements, the hot trickling wetness, the sounds. It all eventually stopped. I bit my lip and held my breath, still waiting. Feathers. Silver feathers drifting across the pillow like snow. A heavy gust of air that carried a sour copper tang to my nose, laced with sweetness and rot. A cold, empty space opened up at my back before the window slammed shut against the sudden wind. The milk has dried up now, and I keep my windows locked. I don't go to that bar anymore. Nice girls don't do things like that.
When Carol told me she was going to have a girls' weekend with her friends, I knew that I had to make my next move carefully. Act 2 excited about the news, she might jump to the conclusion that I wanted her gone. Act 2 disappointed, and she might get the idea that I actually like to spend my Friday mornings watching flip-flop reruns. No, I knew that I had to play this one cool. I told her it was fine. Not to worry, I said. I would handle things at the house. Go have fun with your friends, I told her. Enjoy yourself. Okay, my wife smiled, and take care of Sadie for me. Sadie was a 4-year-old Pomeranian, and when I say our Pomeranian, which I really mean is my wife's Pomeranian, that dog absolutely hated me. Okay, not even 10 seconds after my wife finished backing out of the driveway, I was already texting my buddies Eric and Mark to come over and have some fun. Girls' night out could mean only one thing: guys' night in. We ordered pizza and wings, powered up my old Nintendo 64, we had Smash Brothers, beer, and absolutely no supervision whatsoever. Could this get any better? Around midnight, I heard Sadie barking obnoxiously in the kitchen. God, I hate that dog. Her bark was so shrill, I swear it could wake the dead. I told Eric and Mark to hold on. I needed to go let Sadie out, and I'd be right back. When I picked her up, however, she snapped at my hand. Ah! I yelped, as my friends laughed at me. Guess we know who's the boss around here, Mark said sarcastically. My buddies put their controllers down and followed me as I attempted to track down Sadie. It wasn't exactly a difficult task with her irritating barking, and we quickly located her in front of the basement door. Now, Sadie was the type of dog that liked to bark at everything, but even this was peculiar behavior coming from her. The hair on the back of her neck stuck up like needles. She was baring her teeth towards the basement with murderous intent. Never seen her so worked up before. Come on, girl, I said. We walked downstairs to see what the problem was. What we found at the bottom of the stairs was, well, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my entire life. There was a gigantic slit suspended in midair, maybe 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide. It looked almost as if somebody had taken the fabric of space and time and just ripped it open like an old rag. Blue and green light with textures of flames twirled around inside. I was at a loss for words. I had no idea how to conceptualize what this thing was, or why it was in my basement, or even worse, how I was possibly going to explain this to my wife. It looked like some kind of wormhole had opened up inside my basement. The others seemed to agree. Whatever it was, Sadie didn't like it one bit. She paced back and forth menacingly, growling at the large opening, but careful not to get too close. Eric wanted to know what would happen if we threw something inside, and after some searching, he managed to procure a muddied tennis ball from a nearby shelf. He took the ball and gave it a soft toss into the abyss, which swallowed the ball whole. It was gone. Hold on, I have an idea, I said. I grabbed an old coil of rope and tied it to a 10-pound kettlebell from my home gym. With a heave, I tossed the weight into the portal and watched as it disappeared behind the flames. For a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then, something about the portal changed. Its flames, once a bluish-green color, deepened into a menacing red. The rope, which until then had remained limp in my hands, started to twitch as the hole sucked in the rest of the coil. At first it unraveled slowly, but picked up speed over time until in just a couple of seconds, the rope was peeling off like a spool on a fishing wire. I panicked, unsure of what to do, and I tried to stop the rope with my bare hands, but it quickly became apparent what a bad idea that was. The rope uncoiled furiously in my hand, ripping into my palms that caused me to yelp in pain. "Help!" I shouted, looking at Eric and Mark. The two of them grabbed the section of rope with me, and we heaved backwards with all our weight. Something was tugging on the other end of the line, causing the cord to stretch taut. So much pressure was building up in the strand that I could hear groaning noises from the fibers as they rubbed against one another. Eric and Mark were struggling to breathe behind me, and I could only assume their faces were red from the strain. Suddenly, the rope snapped in half, sending the three of us flying backwards in a tumbled mess, while the rest of the rope was sucked up like a spaghetti noodle. Sadie went berserk. She was barking furiously at the portal before leaping in after the rope. She was gone before I could even stop her. I called out to her in my sweetest voice, even offering her a treat in the hopes that by some miracle she might leap out, but no such luck. "Oh my God, my wife's gonna kill me," I groaned. To add insult to injury, there was suddenly an audible click, and all the lights shut off. Things just kept getting better and better. Save for the eerie glow coming from the portal, everything was pitch black. "Come on, guys," I said. "I'll reset the breaker." It was hard to see, which made it rather difficult to navigate the maze of supplies that built up over the years. Eric and Mark kept bumping into each other behind me, and one of them, I think it was Mark, almost fell over. "Jesus, Mark," I heard Eric say. "Your breath smells like shit. You ever heard of a toothbrush?" Eric was right. I could smell his breath from here. God, it was disgusting. Man was an absolute garbage disposal for food. When we reached the breaker, I still couldn't see much of anything, so I asked to borrow somebody's phone. I felt a stiff hand tap me on the back, followed by the weight of an iPhone perched on my shoulder. "Thanks," I said, and flicked the lights back on, and flicked on the backlight to see what I was doing. Half thinking it wouldn't work, and half praying that it would, I reset the main breaker. And to my surprise, and to my amazement, the lights flickered back on. Something was changed now. I looked behind me and realized that Mark was still there, but Eric had disappeared. Mark threw me a confused look. We walked back to the portal with a panic. Had something happened? Things got even weirder when I saw that the mysterious wormhole, which had been there only moments ago, has now vanished. It was gone. Missing as if it had never been there in the first place. Eric wouldn't have jumped through the portal, would he? Or even worse, what if something came out and grabbed him? I could feel sweat starting to roll down my forehead as I considered progressively worse possibilities. A wave of relief poured over me when I heard the basement door opening at the top of the stairs and saw Eric standing there with a stupid grin on his face. "I went to get a flashlight," he explained sheepishly. I surveyed the area one last time, where the portal had been before, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, or having a psychotic break. We went back upstairs, and the three of us gathered around the kitchen table. I looked at each of them, seriously, searching for some kind of explanation. "We all saw what I think we saw, right?" I asked. Eric and Mark nodded their heads, and I sighed, partly out of relief that I wasn't going crazy, and partly out of fear from what we had just seen. "Look," I said, pointing at each of them, "not a word about this to my wife. I don't even know how I'm going to tell her about any of this. She's going to think I'm on drugs or something." Mark and Eric each agreed. They wouldn't say anything to anyone till I had a chance to talk to Carol. The two of them waited a couple of minutes, but I could tell they were eager to get out of here. We high-fived each other goodbye, then Eric and Mark ran out of the house as fast as they could. Can't say I blame them. We were all pretty spooked. I, for my part, slept with a shotgun next to me that night. The next morning, I woke up to a buzz from my cell phone. I expected it to be a text from my wife telling me that she was coming home soon. I looked over and realized that it wasn't from my wife at all. It was a text from Mark. "Hey, buddy," it read. "Sorry I missed your message. Christina and I went camping up in the Adirondack for the weekend, and cell phone reception was terrible. I can't believe I missed guys' night. Maybe we can do it next weekend. I promise to make it up to you guys. Hope you and Eric had fun without me." Hi everyone, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you something before we get started on tonight's story. Tonight's story is actually written by Christopher Maxim, and I'm not sure if you all have noticed, but we haven't gotten anything new from him in quite a while. Well, with the current pandemic that's going on, it is making life significantly more difficult for Chris. He's in a situation where he can very much be affected by the virus as well as his ability to work. And so he reached out to me and asked me to be able to reach out to you. If you guys are interested in any of Chris Maxim's work, you can find his books available in the links in the description down below. You can also find a link available down below that goes directly to donations for him to be able to keep him moving, keep him shaking, and hopefully be able to see some more stuff from him in the future. Okay, that's all for today, folks. On to tonight's story. As a freelance convention planner, I stay at many hotels over the course of a year. I spend about a week per trip in an all-expense-paid suite of my choosing, doing nothing but studying the location and interviewing the staff on hand to get a feel for the hotel and its traffic. I then spend another week organizing the event and ensuring my client is satisfied with his plans. There's a little more to it, but that's the overall gist of the job. If you can get over the constant jet lag, it's not a bad gig. In all my years of planning conventions, I must have stayed in over 100 different hotels, with similar floor plans, architecture, and staff training. They all kind of blend together in my mind. But one, in particular, will always stay with me. The Grovewood Inn, located just on the outskirts of Cape Cod. That one kept me up for many nights, even after I left. At first, my trip to Grovewood Inn seemed mostly forgettable. The convention I was planning for was a glorified book club meeting for a group of older women and some local authors. The service, food, and layout of the hotel were average and unexciting. The only thing I liked about this place was Clara, the desk clerk. I'd have even asked her out on a date had she not been married. I had planned boring conventions before and been to many subpar hotels, but this trip was remarkably mind-numbing. I couldn't wait for it to be done. One night at the inn, after a long day of mundane event planning, I flipped on the TV, poured a glass of wine, and climbed into bed. I grabbed the program guide from my bedside table and looked it over, hoping to find, the porn networks. As I glanced through the channel listings, something at the bottom of the page caught my eye. Written crudely in permanent marker was the following: Elevator code 03, 08, 06, B1, 04, 02, 07, B2, 05, 01. This was odd. I knew of hotels that had pin pads on their elevators, surely to prevent children from using them, but the Grovewood Inn was not one of them. Plus, most pin pad elevators only required a 4-digit code. Intrigued, I decided to call up the front desk to find out more. I was sure the code would turn out to be something trivial and uninteresting, but it was, at the very least, an excuse to talk to Clara again. Though, unreciprocated, I enjoyed flirting with her, if for no other reason than to hear her infectious laughter. A sip of wine and a few failed pickup lines later, and I was back at square one. Clara didn't know anything about it, claiming there was no devices in the entire building that would require a code like that, much less one of the elevators. She did, however, point out that the numbers in the code aligned with every floor in the hotel, 1 through 8, plus the 2 basement levels. We both found this odd, but ultimately couldn't make sense of it. After getting off the phone with Clara, my curiosity got the best of me. I left my room, I walked over to the elevator, I stepped inside. I then pressed the buttons in the order they were written on my channel guide to see if anything were to happen. And, much to my disappointment, the elevator did nothing but take me to every floor of the hotel, before finally stopping at the lobby. The front desk was an eye shot of the elevator, so I quickly hit the button for my floor, not wanting to explain to Clara what I was up to. Though I didn't have a shot with her, it still would have been embarrassing to tell her I was spending my night playing with an elevator. Luckily, I was able to escape unseen. Upon stepping foot back on my floor, I noticed a member of the cleanup crew walking down the hall. And that's when it hit me. See, the staff never used the patron elevators. They had their own service elevator to get from floor to floor without impeding the travel of guests. It may sound ridiculous, but I needed to know if the code worked in that elevator, if for no other reason than to placate my undying curiosity. I inconspicuously made my way down the hall, heading to the service elevator. Once there, the familiar sting of disappointment set in. A staff card was required to gain access, no doubt to keep guests from using it. Feeling defeated and realizing how crazy I was letting boredom make me, I walked back to my room. After a few more glasses of wine, I drifted off and entered a long, peaceful, alcohol-induced slumber. I awoke many hours later to sunlight flooding my room and the familiar sound of a vacuum next door. Cleanup is always in full force in the mornings at hotels. When the initial grogginess of waking up wore off, something came to mind, something that caused me to jump to my feet and immediately exit my room. There in the middle of the hall was the cleaning cart. And there was no staff in sight. Hanging from a lanyard was the maid's staff card, ripe for the taking. This was it. This was my chance. And maybe it was the slight hangover I had, or perhaps it truly was the monotony of planning a less than exciting convention, but I grabbed that card and I ran to the service elevator like it was calling to me. It was a mystery I desperately felt the need to solve. Upon swiping the maid's card and entering the elevator, I quickly punched the code and waited. At first, nothing happened. The elevator didn't move, but the buttons all remained illuminated. I thought that, maybe I somehow busted the thing, but the preceding moments proved this theory wrong. Without warning, the elevator raced up the heights of the hotel, ascending much faster than normal. The digital readout above counted the floors up to 8, and then kept going until it reached 12. This was bizarre, as the Grovewood Inn only had 8 floors, and there was no discernible reason the elevator should have been able to reach that height. By any account, I would have been in the sky by that point. After a few moments, the elevator door opened, revealing behind it a grand ballroom. The likes of which I'd never seen before in any of the hotels I'd been to. Victorian-era chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Beautiful silk banners danced from wall to wall, and hundreds of people, dressed in old-fashioned attire and elegant facewear, waltzed about as a large band played a catchy tune. My jaw was on the floor. It's hard to explain, but a romantic fog filled the air. I watched as masked patrons danced in unison and partook in lavish festivities, completely oblivious to my presence. For a moment or two, I completely forgot about the hotel below, awestruck by the scene before me. Something about it was absolutely intoxicating. And just as I was about to step out of the elevator, the music stopped. All at once, the ballroom guests turned around to face me and held their gaze with mine, almost as if peering into my very soul. It became quickly apparent that I was not welcome here, an uninvited and unwanted visitor in a room I was never supposed to reach. It was clear to me that it was time for me to leave. I tried to press the button for the lobby, but it wouldn't light up. I tried floor 2, 3, 4, no dice. The elevator was stagnant, and I was trapped. I looked back over the crowd, and to my horror, they had begun walking in my direction. Their march was slow, but without a working elevator, I had no means of escape. I was at the mercy of the ballroom and its occupants now, no matter what that fate entailed. With little in the way of options, I attempted to converse with the group. "Who are you? What do you want with me?" My query was met with little reaction. The only response I received was the continued sound of footsteps on the ballroom floor. Frightened of what was to come next, I backed up as far as the elevator would allow, a mouse cornered in a bird's cage. Just as the vultures closed the gap between us, an explosion of fire emerged from the background, overcoming the guests and engulfing the entire room in flames. I began to cough uncontrollably from the toxic smoke that loomed above. Beads of sweat the size of pearls dripped down my cheeks. To top it off, the guests were still standing there. Standing still at the foot of the elevator, somehow unfazed by the fiery heat around them. In between coughs, I managed to offer them one last question, though I knew it would probably go unanswered. "What do you want?" A woman at the front of the crowd stepped forward. She wore a fox mask and a slight grin, though her lips would soon spread apart to speak. "We want to be saved," At this moment, the flames took flight, rising to the highest heights of the ballroom. Molten skin dripped from the woman's frame like candle wax as her features morphed into a gruesome arrangement of congealed flesh and bubbling blisters. "Won't you save us?" In a grotesque slur of unnatural movement, the woman slumped in my direction, arms outstretched. I stood still in terror as her burnt fingers made their way to my neck. Just as she was about to make contact, the door shut behind her, and the lights went out. The bulb in the elevator, the fire in the ballroom, it was all gone. The energy around me had dissipated abruptly, leaving nothing but pitch blackness in its place, and somehow I was alone. A few moments of confusion passed, followed by a loud roar from the elevator shaft below. All at once, everything sprung back to life, save for the fox-masked assailant. As the elevator dropped, I watched the digital readout count backward from 12. Eventually, it was back in the familiar territory, safe and sound on the ground floor before the doors could fully open. And I made a mad dash for the front desk. "Clara! Hey, what's got you so frazzled? What are you doing in the service elevator?" If I told her what I'd seen, she'd think I was crazy. Instead, I composed myself and I asked her for some information. Did this hotel ever have a 12th floor? Clara looked very surprised by my question. Yes, it did. The Grovewood Inn was originally almost twice this height, but a lot of it burned up in a bad fire, so it had to be reconstructed. The top floor was a ballroom, but that was a very long time ago. She pointed at a framed picture on the wall behind her. Dated 1913. Why do you ask? No reason. Just curious, that's all. I promptly made my way back to my room, and I reflected on everything. I wondered if I'd see the picture without realizing it and dreamed up my elevator escapade. I discarded this thought rather quickly, sure that I was wide awake when it happened. Thought it might have been something in the wine. That was equally unlikely. There was no logical explanation for what occurred. That's about it. See, I never found out exactly what happened that day in the hotel. I mustered up enough courage to try the code again, but it didn't work. Seems I was allowed a one-time glimpse into the past, a look at what was before and what might still be today, had the hotel not partially been destroyed. I only wish that I could have taken part in the festivities before the things went sour. Perhaps I could have somehow prevented the fire. I could have saved the patrons. Just like the fox masked woman wanted. All I can do now is look back on that day, completely bewildered, as I plan my next convention. So I'll tell you right now that my story doesn't have any dramatic climax or any cathartic resolution, so don't bother listening to this if that's what you're looking for. My story is of one very specific moment in my life, one which, try as I might, I can't negate as a trick that my exhausted brain played on me, or a momentary lapse of reason and subsequent plunge into childish fears. I think a fear of mirrors must be fairly common, in this day and age. I remember when I was young, I saw one of those compilation TV horror shows, and it was one where there'd be a different short, scary story between commercial breaks. And in retrospect, it wasn't the scariest thing in the world. If I saw it again today, I'd probably invite friends over and we'd quash our collective fears by mocking the bad acting or the ridiculous storyline. All I remember of it is that in the story, a man was being constantly tormented by a disfigured, murderous psychopath. But he only saw him when he looked in the mirror. The whole story was a typical song and dance of the man catching his stalker in the mirror behind him, turning to face him and finding nothing there. And maybe the reason I remember it so well is because It was so shortly after I heard my mother die. I say heard because I never saw the body. I was watching TV, it was a different show at the time, but when I heard what sounded like porcelain breaking, followed by a loud thud coming from the kitchen 2 rooms away. The sudden noise was oddly unsurprising, but I remember craning my head to see my mom's legs sprawled on the tile floor. Couldn't see any more of her. The door frame was in the way. Luckily, I suppose, my father ran in first, calling her name, somewhat frantically, as I stood up, but didn't advance out of what I imagined was fear. I remember him telling me, he told me to stay where I was. Well, the doctors told us a virus had gotten into her heart. I remember my father, he protested that he hadn't even heard of that before. And neither had I. But the concept of death itself was fairly new to me. See, I remember being filled with an overwhelming sense of existential fear, as if I or anyone I knew could suddenly just crumble into a pile of lifeless dust at any moment. I don't think I was a very fearful child, though, not more so than most, and even my unease around mirrors didn't exactly trump my other fears of spiders or being in cramped spaces. It makes sense that mirrors are a source of fear for people. One of the defining signs of self-awareness is whether or not an animal recognizes itself in a mirror. Maybe we still retain some primal belief that what we're seeing really isn't us, but some sinister shadow self. And not to mention all the scenes in horror movies that use them. A character bends down to splash water in their face. When they lift their head back up, their face is distorted in some gruesome way. I just gotten home from a party at a nearby frat house. I lived in an old Victorian house that 4 of my friends from school and we all rented. And I was the only one home. I left the party early, being called 2 in the morning early. And my roommates, they were all still out. I ran upstairs to my room, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to lay my head in my bed, feel the rest of the world leave me behind, but I didn't. In rare form, I decided to take a few more steps down the hall to the old, poorly designed bathroom the 2 of my roommates shared with me. It was lit by a single fluorescent bulb, casting the black and white tile in a sickly, near-green color. I ran a thin strip of toothpaste on my brush and gave my teeth a once-over before spitting the slightly brown spit and foam down the sink. And when I looked back up, I saw her, standing behind me, in the bathtub with the curtain drawn wide open, my mother's mouth hung down as if screaming, but without any sound. I could tell it was my mother, but she was a grotesque shadow of how I remember her. Her eyes were either completely gone or simply black in color. The sockets were vacuums within which nothing reached. Her skull was so pale it was almost blue. Her dark hair looked drenched in water, hugging her scalp tight and falling in front of her shoulders in thin strips. Her mouth wasn't exactly screaming, it was so much as it was hanging open, impossibly open, much further than a person's jaw can extend. She seemed to be wearing a thin white nightgown, drenched, like her hair clinging to her emaciated body. Her stick-thin legs looked like they were going to buckle under her weight, while her arms reached back against the wall. And I must have seen her for only a second before turning, screaming, falling down backwards, slamming hard against the tile floor. The tub was empty. There had been no sound, and now, as the echoes of my cry dissipated, I could only hear my heavy breathing. I don't know how long I lay on the floor of the bathroom, the fluorescent bulb dully buzzing as I became too frightened to even move. Eventually, I heard the downstairs door swing open, as a parade of drunk college boys and their floozies poured in for the... They found me on the floor. Thought it was hilarious that I was so drunk I almost passed out in the bathroom. You know, I never saw her again. I never want to see her again, and every day I wish I hadn't. There's myths of people being scared to death, being haunted by dreams of a single event for their whole lives. I've had dreams, you know, but they aren't what haunts me to this very day. So when someone you love dies, you tend to forget everything bad about them. And eventually your fond memories of them just coalesce into a fondness you share with everyone else that knew them. But that's not how I feel about my mother. I was too young to have endless loving stories about her, and instead all I can remember is her face that night in the mirror. So my story doesn't end with me taking my own life or anything dramatic like that. I mean, I've had thoughts about it, though. I tried pulling a length of rope across my neck one day and squeezing to see what it would feel like, but I'd never be able to go through with it. It isn't so much that I want to live. What bothers me is that I don't know for sure what happens when we die. I mean, nobody does. What I saw that night in the mirror, makes me think I do. I find camping especially relaxing, you know, just being out in nature. It's already quite soothing on its own, but roughing it out in the middle of it all just adds a completely different layer to the experience. There's something about the simplicity of it all. It's inherently calming, peaceful. It's an experience you can't get in modern society anymore, and when your main concerns are nothing more than food, water, warmth, and shelter, it becomes a lot easier to lose track. It's a great way to take a brief moment to forget about the more indistinct worries of life, like success and fulfillment. You know, it's not like camping is all fun and games, s'mores, campfires. There's always some element of real danger when you trade the safety of brick and mortar walls for the thin, flimsy fabric of a tent. Whenever you're camping in Yellowstone or even in your own backyard, this fact remains true. This risk is just another part of the experience, though. It makes the whole thing all the more exciting. That's not to say that it can't be taken too far, though. See, personally, I've had many harrowing and outright terrifying experiences when camping. In fact, for this very reason, more than a few campsites which I've visited over the years that I've outright refused to ever return to. This story is about, well, one of those times. You don't usually expect anything to go wrong on the short camping trips. It's always on the long, multi-day treks through miles of wilderness that you expect to find real danger. It's usually the case anyway. I mean, it's not like you'll often run into an irate bear roaming through the small patch of woods behind your parents' house. Now, that is unless you live in the sort of area where that exact thing occurs. But that's besides the point. This story doesn't take place in that sort of area, and it most certainly isn't about a bear. Now, this story is about something a tad bit more unpleasant. This all happened quite a long time ago, back when I was in high school and only just starting to get into camping. My then girlfriend was the main driving force in that regard. She had gone on many camping trips, both with her family and while she was in the Scouts, so she was very much so an old hand at it. My family and I, on the other hand, we were quite the opposite. When your older brother has a laundry list of allergies that includes pollen and several species of grass, you're generally limited in the variety of outdoor activities that you can do as a family. Despite my inexperience, I took to it like a fish to water. In our first year of dating, we ended up going camping together at least once a month, if not more. Of course, living in the flatlands of central Illinois, our options for campsites were somewhat limited. That is, unless we particularly felt like pitching our tents in the middle of a cornfield. In spite of that, though, we had several spots that we regularly frequented. One of these spots was a campground in a decently sized park, about a 30-minute drive from my house. In truth, it wasn't exactly the most authentic camping experience, per se. You pulled off from the main road onto a gravel road that led into the woods, past these small gates, and after driving for a bit, You'd come across several loops of gravel paths arranged in a slightly misshapen four-leaf clover. Along each of these loops were several little numbered plots that each came with a fire pit of sorts. You'd pull your car into whichever free spot strikes your fancy and start setting up camp. After that, sometime usually before sundown, the caretaker of the campground, an elderly man who lives in an RV near the entrance with his wife, would come around and collect your payment. At $8 a night per tent was rather reasonable. I'd like to jokingly call it drive-in camping, but it wasn't like I didn't enjoy the convenience of it all. That evening was much like any other that we had spent out there, at least at first. We had just finished up and we began to settle in for the night. And something a bit outside the norm occurred. It was nearly sundown, around the time when the caretaker would usually lock up the gates, when a new arrival pulled into the campground. Their irritatingly bright headlights cut through the otherwise calm evening, announcing their arrival to the entire campground. The caretaker followed along just behind them, needing to collect their payment and get the new arrival settled before he could get back to closing up for the night. The late arrival wasn't an entirely uncommon sight at the campground, but it certainly wasn't a particularly welcome one either. Most everyone who visited the campground knew better than to arrive this late, as there wasn't exactly that much daylight left for them to set up camp. My girlfriend and I sighed, giving each other a knowing look. See, we were more or less familiar with the type of people that would usually pull this sort of thing, and neither of us were particularly happy to see them. We expected to see a pack of teenagers, maybe even some from our school, blasting party music out of Bluetooth speakers and sloppily setting up camp by the light of their headlights. It might sound a bit odd, given that we were teenagers ourselves, but we really hated their sort. We soon found, though, that this new arrival was more than a little far off from what we expected. Sitting around our campfire, my girlfriend and I watched on in uneasy confusion as the new arrival, their unnecessarily large truck, slowly approached, pulling into the spot right next to us. The caretaker seemed a bit perturbed by this as well. He glanced around the loop, noting that there were only 2 other groups in the campground that day, and that they were in completely different loops from us and this new arrival. Pulling up alongside the still-running truck, he talked with the driver for a brief few moments before directing them towards a spot much farther away from us. My girlfriend and I gave each other a relieved glance. Neither of us were particularly good with conversation, and we generally liked to keep to ourselves. We certainly didn't want a completely unnecessary and unwelcome neighbor. We decided to ignore this new arrival and get back to enjoying our evening, not wanting to let this little mishap ruin the entire night. We quickly found this difficult to do, however, as even more peculiarities drew our attention straight back to the truck some distance away from us. To begin with, the new arrival, a man who appeared to be in his late 30s, set up his camp remarkably quickly. His tent was completely pitched before the old caretaker had even made it back to his RV, and he had a fire going mere minutes after that. He was clearly experienced with this sort of thing. All finished setting up camp, the man returned to his truck and started unloading several items. First were 2 sizable duffel bags, which were tossed promptly into the tent. Next came a decently sized cooler and a camping stool, which soon found their place next to the fire. Pulling a beer out of the cooler, the man settled down into his seat, and then he just stared at us. His gaze was steady and unwavering, constantly fixed on us as he sat there and sipped his beer. My girlfriend and I were confused and unnerved. Did that man know us? Neither of us could think of any reason why he would. We didn't recognize his truck or the man himself, at least not from what we could make out of his distant features dimly illuminated by the fire. His attention made us uncomfortable, to say the least. Yet we tried to rationalize his behavior as best we could. Probably just a coincidence that he was looking in our direction, and even if it was purposeful, what was the harm of just looking? Not like there was really much of anything else to look at in the pitch-black campground. In the several hours that we had sat in front of our respective fires, the man did not budge an inch from his seat. His only movement had been to sip his beer and occasionally reach for another. Neither my girlfriend or I had been keeping count of his empty bottles, but we were certain that they numbered quite a few. We tried our best to relax and forget about the man, yet we failed miserably. Resigned, we ultimately decided to just turn in, hoping that out of sight, out of mind would get us through the night. My girlfriend was out like a light within minutes, and all the time I'd known her, the girl had never had any trouble sleeping. It was a talent, really. I, on the other hand, was much less fortunate with sleep. I spent hours laying awake in the tent, my thoughts racing. Try as I might, I couldn't get my mind off that man and all the possible reasons for his behavior. I wished in that moment that I hadn't spent the entire night prior watching true crime documentaries. It had definitely given me a healthy dose of paranoia. All it took was the sound of a single branch crunching just outside our tent to send all of my thoughts flying from my mind. The sound pierced the peaceful veil of night, drilling into my very core. I was laser-focused, listening for any trace of further sound. At first, there was nothing. But then came the occasional rustling of leaves, the rhythmic movement through grass. I hadn't noticed it at first over the chirping of insects, but someone was making their way slowly to our tent. My hand slowly inched closer to my pants pocket, even as the rest of me froze up. Reaching inside, I pulled out a small pocket knife I often carried with me on camping trips. I flicked the blade open with my thumb and held it close to my chest, my hands shaking. I felt less like a person preparing to defend themselves and more like a small child pulling their bed sheets up to their chin, trembling in fear of the monster in their closet. The footsteps came to halt just outside our tent. The dim light of the full moon was just enough to cast a faint silhouette of the unwelcome visitor against the side of the tent. I wasn't 100% sure, but it seemed like it could be the profile of the strange man. He stood there for a moment completely still, seemingly without even breathing. I might have forgotten he was there entirely if not for the looming shadow cast against the side of my tent. Then came movement, subtle enough that I wasn't able to tell exactly what was happening just from his shadow. I clutched my knife tighter, though, as a realization came over me. He was reaching out towards our tent. 5 slightly darker semicircles emerged from amongst his shadow as his fingertips came to rest gently against the fabric. They slowly started downward in a sort of meandering stroke as the man let out a slightly shuddering sigh of pleasure. The fingertips then drew back ever so slowly. My faint breath froze in my throat, full of fear as to what might come, and yet, nothing more came. The silhouette of the man faded into nothing as he receded into the night with muffled footsteps. I laid there, trembling for nearly half an hour before I was able to convince myself to calm down. As the fear receded, though, something that I was not quite expecting took its place. I was angry, more livid than I'd ever been in my entire life. I mean, how dare he fuck with us like this? I wasn't going to take it lying down. No, not this time. He had pushed me too far and I was done with it. I was ready to storm over to his camp right there and then, but I decided to wake up my girlfriend first. I wasn't so far gone in my anger as to leave her alone, asleep and unaware of what was going on. She wasn't entirely convinced I hadn't just had a nightmare or something, but she insisted on coming with me to confront the man. Now, I knew better than to try and convince her otherwise, and besides, I didn't quite want to admit it to myself. I was happy to not have to go alone. As we made our way across the campground, I found myself subconsciously silencing my footsteps as best I could. I mean, I was angry, sure, but that didn't mean I was more eager for confrontation than I usually was. The cool night air eased the adrenaline of anger, allowing a twinge of fear to creep back in as we neared the tent. I was able to muster up enough determination, though, as to not let my steps falter. My first attempt came out as a quiet squeak, hastily covered up with an embarrassing cough, but I eventually managed to call out a forceful "hey" as we entered the man's tent. However, in spite of my efforts, there was no answer. We waited a few moments, but there wasn't even a rustle of movement from the tent. I cautiously leaned in a bit closer, yet I couldn't even hear the faintest breath of sound from the tent. It seemed that the man was out. I realized then that when the man had left our tent previously, he hadn't actually left in the direction of his own tent. I had been too preoccupied with my fear to notice at first, but he actually seemed to do the exact opposite, heading directly into the woods surrounding the campsite. I swallowed my unease. I decided to take a look inside his tent. I mean, I know I could have gotten myself into a fair bit of trouble for doing so, but I couldn't just quietly go back to my tent empty-handed, not after all that had happened. I had no idea what I expected to find in there other than just normal camping stuff, but I hoped that there might be something that would shed some light onto what had been going on. But there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The tent was empty. Not just of occupants, but of any sort of possessions as well. The 2 duffel bags the man had tossed in previously were nowhere to be seen. There wasn't even any sort of indication that the man had ever had any intentions of actually sleeping there. I was completely caught off guard. I mean, I may have had no idea what to expect, but I certainly wasn't expecting absolutely nothing. Except that wasn't exactly the case. Upon a second closer inspection, I realized that there was, in fact, one thing inside the tent. Something I had missed at first glance. There was a strangely dirty piece of printer paper, slightly crumpled, discarded in the corner of the tent. Perhaps it had been left behind unintentionally. I carefully picked it up by one of its corners, flipping it over while also doing my best to avoid touching the suspiciously fresh-looking stains. It was a picture that the man had printed off his computer. Not just any picture, though. It was a picture of us. I almost immediately recognized it as a picture that my girlfriend had posted to her Twitter a couple of months ago. The man had made alterations, though. My entire face had been angrily crossed out in dark, heavy lines, which had been drawn with such force and anger as to completely tear through the paper. We didn't waste any time going to the camp manager with what we had found, and the police were called shortly after that. The 20 minutes or so that we had spent waiting inside the old caretaker's RV were incredibly stressful, to say the least. Thankfully, though, it was completely uneventful. The police took our statements when they arrived, and soon after began their search. They kept things very hush-hush, staying professional, yet perhaps not immediately taking the whole thing all too seriously. Around 10 minutes into the search, though, there was a sudden change in their demeanor. There was a bit of a radio chatter that I couldn't make out, and then any trace of good humor was gone, replaced by staunch seriousness with some distinct hints of unease. I later learned that this was when they had happened upon the man's belongings, abandoned in the middle of a small clearing that he had been in the possession of, covering with taped-down plastic sheets. They never told us exactly what they had found inside the duffel bags that had been out there, but to be honest, they really didn't have to. Our imaginations did all the work well enough. Neither of us were particularly eager to know exactly what the man had planned for us. They didn't find the man that night. They were able to identify him from certain DNA evidence that he left behind, though, and they eventually caught him a few months later during a random traffic stop a few states over, driving a stolen truck. All the same, though, what happened that night has still stuck with me over the years. In a way, I'm sort of thankful for that day. Things could have gone easily a lot worse for me and my then girlfriend, and in the end, I learned a valuable lesson. See, there really is something to that old Boy Scout motto of being prepared. Now I never go camping without a fully loaded firearm. Seems like the only reasonable thing to do. In 1989, we detected a faint call coming from the depths of the ocean. A strange cry from a massive creature, traveling alone in the vast blue waters below. Now, at first it sounded like an oddity, a malfunctioning hydrophone, but then we heard it again in 1990, and in 1991. With only 5% of the ocean explored, baffled us. To any untrained ear, it sounded like a whale, but its pitch was too high, measuring at frequencies of 52 hertz. It meant that the song couldn't be understood by any known species of whale. Thus it was destined to exist on its own. and it's been dubbed the loneliest creature in the world. We called him Blue 52. Every year we'd hear the lonesome wail, measured through hydrophones, spread across the west coast of America and Canada, and still it wouldn't be until 2019 before we finally lay eyes upon it. Our crew was tasked with finding him, tag him with a tracker, observe for others like him. On board the RV Song of Solitude. On board the RV Song of Solitude, we traversed the North Pacific in search of a whale that had been heard but never seen. With technology constantly advancing, tracking it had become much easier. While it took us weeks just to locate him, we grew closer with each passing day. "Do you think he knows?" Rita asked as we stared out at the horizon. The ocean was calm, gently rocking our large research vessel. It was wonderfully peaceful, and though our mission was interesting, it carried an undeniable hint of dread. "Knows what?" I asked. She sighed. "That there's others like him out there?" It was a fair question. Whether or not the strange frequency of its voice was caused by a deformity or if it was a hybrid species, it had to have been raised by someone. Whale calves stay approximately 1 year with their mothers as they grow and get ready to face the oceans alone. I don't know. Why else would he sing? The whale had been traveling in the same path as blue whales, yet the timing was off. It meant that, despite it going exactly the same way, it would never meet anyone else in its journey. Wherever he swam, the others were long gone. 40 years alone, just looking for someone else. She trailed off. Weeks passed as we searched. And in the late summer of 2019, we finally found him. There it was, surfacing for a breath of fresh air. An 80-foot-long whale, spurting a fountain of water from his blowhole. He had a magnificent blue color. The shape of his body resembled that of a fin whale. Our theory of it being a hybrid had been confirmed, and he looked extraordinarily healthy, considering he'd been surviving on his own for so long. "He's magnificent," Rita exclaimed in excitement. Without hesitation, we planted a tracker on his skin with a suction cup, and let him dive back beneath the ocean. We went to work and recorded more of his song, a somber tune of melancholy. We spent the next 3 weeks just tracking him, hoping to see another of his kind. Yet he remained alone. During the nights, I often found Rita staring out at the ocean, marking each time he surfaced to breathe. He looks too sad. "How can you tell?" I asked. "I don't know, just a gut feeling I get. Poor Eros." "Eros?" "Yeah. Figured with the closest thing he has to a family, we ought to be the ones naming him." I mulled over the name for a moment. It certainly sounded better than Blue 52. A bit ironic, though, don't you think? "Not at all." As the mission went on, Rita started sleeping less and less. She was afraid that we'd lose Eros if we didn't keep a constant eye on him. Whales hardly ever sleep, constantly needing to resurface. Always on the move. Of all the mammals, they have the lowest requirement of sleep. We were 2 months into our mission when I was shook awake in the middle of the night. As I opened my heavy eyes, I saw Rita standing above me with a wide smile on her face. "There's another whale!" she shouted. We rushed to the control room where Captain Banks stood, eyes fixed on a set of new frequencies. Sure enough, there were 2 distinct, but similar sources of sound coming from about 1,000 feet below. "I knew it! I knew Eros wasn't alone!" Suddenly, our depressing job had turned into one of joy. If there were 2, we could assume with high probability that there'd be more. In fact, we might have been witnessing the beginning of a new subspecies of whale. It was a beautiful moment to behold. "You're sure it's just not a malfunction?" one of the crew members asked. I took a look at the numbers. Eros' voice had lowered a bit in his last years, at 50 hertz, while the others, the new source, were slightly higher pitched. "Could it be a calf?" "No idea. The sonar isn't picking anything up." We need to get closer. We waited until morning and tried to get closer to Eros. According to the sonar readings, there was a creature roughly twice the size of our whale, swimming a couple of thousand feet beneath the surface. Even for a whale, it was huge. About an hour passed. We finally caught Eros coming up for air. Despite tracking 2 distinct beings, only one of them ever breached the surface. Do you see anything? I asked. No, it's not coming up. Are we sure it's a whale? What else could it be? I don't know, but even whales can't hold their breath forever. We discussed the possibility of a new species entirely, but before we could even alert our superiors back at the mainland, we heard something else. It was a third song, then a fourth, and then a fifth, and before long, a whole pod of these creatures had been detected. They were massive, far larger than any known creature to occupy the ocean. It was a frightening but intriguing discovery. We ordered to send down a submersible drone to get an actual view of the beings. I controlled the machine, and as it quickly descended down 1,000 feet, we held our breaths as the light of the sun gave way to the darkness of the ocean. Before long, we'd be right on top of the unidentifiable animals. The hell? Where the hell are they? Captain Banks asked. There, I saw something. It was Eros, diving down to follow the drone. He seemed to understand that the device belonged to us and started leading us towards the other creatures. We followed Eros down further, 2,000 feet below the surface, before we finally found them. At first, all we saw were yellow, glowing orbs dangling in the darkness. And then we saw the true monstrosities we'd discovered. They're not whales, Rita gasped. They looked like torn pieces of bright green flesh, bobbing up and down like jellyfish through the water. They had massive bodies covered in glowing blisters. Dozens of tendrils reached out of their mangled mass. What we assumed to be their heads had multiple dark holes with thin membranes through which they emitted their songs. What are they? I asked. Before my question could be answered, one of the crew members shouted out in protest. All we heard was a splash as something dropped into the water. Wait, no! He shouted. What happened? Captain Banks asked. Simon, he took an anchor and he jumped off the ship. We peeled our eyes in hopeless search for the lost sailor, but he was long gone. Call the mainland. Tell them what happened, Captain Banks ordered. Get that drone back up. It's time to leave. I glanced back at the screen. The camera had gone dark. We lost contact with the drone. With little hesitation, we decided to set course for the coast. The footage would serve as enough documentation of our discovery. We were still days away from reaching land, but we didn't have any other choice. Nightfall came and plunged us into overwhelming darkness. Nothing but 1,000,000 stars above to keep us lit up in the night. Despite their beauty, they signified the immense size of emptiness surrounding us. What do you think we saw? I asked the captain. He looked over the multiple recordings we'd gotten from our hydrophones. They all matched the voice of Eros in terms of frequency, yet the rhythm seemed completely off. Whale songs can travel 100 miles, no problem. Based on the composition of these things, I'd say they were airless creatures. Would suggest they come from the very depths of the ocean beneath us. I can't say for sure. You think Eros alerted them with his voice? He nodded. Why else would they venture this far up? Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of an anchor moving on deck. We rushed outside to find Rita standing at the edge, staring longingly into the ocean below. Rita? Rita, what are you doing? They're calling for me. Who? The dancers of the sea. Their songs are so beautiful. Don't you hear them? Rita, please step away from the edge, Captain Banks begged. I took a step towards her, ready to snatch her away from the edge. Before I could even get close, she just stepped over and fell into the water. Rita! I shouted in despair. as she sank out of sight. By the time we could even turn around to search for her, she'd be too far gone to rescue anyone that willingly jumped into the depths. They could never be rescued. Captain Banks jumped on the radio, getting ready to demand an airlift back to the mainland. The only sound that greeted us on the other end was that damn song from the depths. Whatever these creatures were, they interfered with our system, making it impossible to call for help. We were effectively trapped. On the ocean, 100 glowing orbs appeared. The creatures, despite coming from thousands of feet below, had the ability to surface, and they were heading straight for us. Oh God, there was all I could get out before the ship shook violently. A tendril reached out from the water and it grabbed one of the crewmen. He screamed in agony as it pierced his abdomen, pulling him into the water. Captain Banks took a knife, tried to cut one of the tendrils that are wrapped around our deck. It was a futile task, and another quickly wrapped around his leg, instantly snapping the bone within, and he screamed as the creature tore at him, digging into the leg, reaching through his abdomen. He was dead before he even hit the water. The ship started to topple over. I clung to the railing, and then something rammed us. The ship fell back into place, the tendrils retreated into the ocean, and they were temporarily free. I looked for a sign of my crewmen, but they'd all been snatched away, alone. I peeked into the waters and I saw what had been my unlikely hero. It was Eros. He had plunged his massive body into the monster, which had redirected its attention towards him. It dug its tendrils into his body. Blood filling the waters, he kept swimming, pulling away from the monstrosities, and they followed. In his wake, he left a trail of blood, leading them away from my damaged vessel, giving me an opportunity to escape. I set course in for the opposite direction, not hesitating to make use of the escape window granted to me. The creatures didn't follow, but I never stopped fleeing. It took another full day before I finally made contact with the mainland. I alerted them to the situation. They sent a ship out to meet me. I had sustained major injuries. My crew, on the other hand, they had also come to the horrors of the ocean. I don't know what happened to Eros, if he managed to get away or if the things caught up with him. But whatever the case, he saved my life. And I owe him everything. In his search for a family, he inadvertently awoke something from the deepest part of the ocean. And according to recent hydrophone recordings, there are millions of them across the Pacific, and they're spreading further and further around the world. The seas are no longer safe, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. I might have made it back to shore, but what truly terrifies me is that despite being 1,000 miles away, I still hear them singing. Now, at first they were only sounds, but now I fully understand. They want me to come to them. And I don't know how long I can resist. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and thank you so much for listening to tonight's story, whether it be an episode of something, or tonight's podcast, or tonight's YouTube. I hope all of you are staying safe in the current pandemic craziness. If you guys are missing out on some of the artwork from some of your favorite artists, you can always check out the description down below, where I'm linking over some of my friends who are not able to do conventions, seeing as all the conventions this year have currently been shut down. So if you're missing out on some of the incredible artwork you can normally get from them, a group of my friends, or a lot of different friends of mine, are all found in the description down below. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons, and you can always join them at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. People like Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Brianna Ventine Jensen, Chapinski, The Red Oak Shield Virus, Sandy Barney, G Weevil 3, Diana Kraus, Stephen Van Huss, Chance Burnett, Tristan Pelton, Nico Cal, The Ginger Bros, Dante Rao, Rafael Rodriguez, Last Blade Song, Eliminator 86, Nebsky, Steampunk Sinner, Caleb Dougal, Daniel Paulson, Sky Harbor, The Homeless Bird 93, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, Aaron Stormcrow, Barbara Macedo, Thomas Burgett, Azazel Rotten, Let's Get Scared, S-Man, Andrew Kirisuba Warnock, Bad Honey, CreepyPasta Adam, Someone You Love, Brennan Wright, Said the King 56, and Somber Puppet. Thank you guys so much for your continued support, to all of you on Patreon, you guys that are down there in the description, and everyone else. And thank you all for listening and watching and being subscribed. Sweet dreams.